Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. In this episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Steve Kraner. Steve describes himself as not a natural negotiator or salesman. He is an engineer who crossed over to the dark side. A military officer and engineer by training, Steve found himself leading a sales team as part of a startup. He had to sell to survive. Negotiating with today's savvy technology buyers is tougher than ever. Steve's updated approach to real-world sales negotiating recognises that not all buyers are win-win negotiators. Many of today's buyers are players who study negotiating and play to win. Steve's Negotiating with the Savvy software buyer program gives your sales negotiators a look in the buyer's handbook so they can anticipate the buyer's negotiating ploys. Steve has the unique ability to bring fun and extraordinary insight into the sometimes acrimonious world of software and SaaS negotiations. In our discussion today, we speak about overcoming not being a natural negotiator, how the NATO defence planning process can assist in negotiations, how role play can benefit you in your negotiation preparation, Steve's experience of a challenging sales negotiation, and much, much more. As always, I hope you enjoy listening to this episode of Negotiation in Real Life. So I'm delighted to introduce Steve Kraner as our guest on Negotiation in Real Life today. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nicole. Glad to be with you today.
And it's a pleasure. We've had a couple of attempts to get together, so I'm pleased that we've finally actually managed to get ourselves both online at the same time with everything working. We're going to have a lot of interesting conversations about some of your experience in negotiations. But before we do, perhaps you could just let the listeners know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, I'm glad to. I'm a farm boy originally from the middle of the United States in Ohio. I large farm family, and I wasn't sure how my parents were going to pay for all the kids to go to college. So I did an Army scholarship. And the reason I mentioned that is, back in those days, I was an airborne ranger. Now I'm more of a PowerPoint ranger. And I'm not really in any way, shape, or form a natural salesperson or a natural negotiator. I was part of a startup back in the 90s. And as a result of that, I was kind of forced to sell against my will. I didn't really want to. And my focus today, really kind of based on that experience, is a sales consultancy that I run that is treating sales like an engineer would, with split testing, experimentation, call recording, having a process and a methodology, and also treating sales like a sport. You see maybe the ballerina in the background there. The Edgar Degas, who painted that, said it takes great effort to make it look effortless. So I think that's one of the things that you and I tend to agree on, that great negotiators behind great performance have a great process. So that's me in a nutshell.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And look, I like that you mentioned not being a natural negotiator. How did you, what was the impact for you when you came into this world of sales of not being a natural negotiator, and how did you overcome it?
So two analogies. One, I take guitar lessons, and there'll be times when I'll ask my guitar instructor, how did you do that? And his answer will be, I don't know. So he can't really pass it on to me because he's at that level of unconscious competence.
Yeah.
And just like sometimes if a young boy wants help getting his tie tied, a man will say, let me show you how to do that. And then you can't do it when you slow down and try to do it because it's just muscle memory and you just do it automatically. I'm also a little claustrophobic. So when it came to swimming, it was difficult for me to swim and to scuba dive. And I think that made me particularly good and patient at systematically taking somebody who can't swim and getting them in a pool and getting them past what might be a little claustrophobia or reluctance, especially older people who are learning to swim late in life. I was an instructor at what we called the Rock Squad at West Point, people who were 20 years old and at that point still didn't know how to swim. And I could get them in the water and I could get them swimming. Same thing with negotiating. People who are just naturally good at it, and there certainly are many of those, aren't necessarily able to pass it on as well as somebody who's struggled a little bit and therefore has developed process, and process is what makes it replicable.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that reference to the unconscious competence model, because that's something I talk about. I mean, most of us are unconsciously competent at negotiation at a particular level. And, I think that's one of the things that I hope for people who are listening to this podcast is even just for a few minutes, we're taking them out of unconscious competence into conscious competence to get them to think about what they're doing so that they can move up to a higher level when they get back to the unconscious world. So I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I agree. If you've had to actually focus on all of those different elements as you're going through, it's certainly a way to actually really understand what's going so that you have that ability to pass it on to someone else. How did you develop that system? What did you do to actually understand what was going on in a negotiation?
So I had a particularly difficult negotiation coming up, and I was really worried about it. It's a situation where a sales VP wanted to bring me in to turn as part of a turnaround of a startup that wasn't quite starting up. And the dates of the training were coming up and I didn't have a signed agreement. So I called him up and said, hey, Rob, what's going on? I don't have an agreement yet. He said, well, the CFO won't sign off on your prices. And I said, well, would you mind maybe if I talk to him directly to see if I could, deal with whatever his concerns are. And he said, sure, I'll set it up. So he sets up a 3-way call. And as I'm looking at what we're about to do, I realized I'm up against a CFO, a New York CFO. CFOs tend to be tough negotiators. He's a New Yorker, so, you don't want to generalize too much. But he's, maybe a tough guy. He's short on cash because they've had 10 rounds of funding. So it's, not the typical situation. They actually are short on cash, and ego-wise, we're on this 3-way call. He's the senior executive. He's got this new executive that wants to bring me in who's going to be on the call listening. So he's going to want to act like a tough guy and show this new guy how it works, right? So we get on the phone. But before we got on the phone, I should say, I actually role played it with my partner. I had something written down, and based on my experience in the Army, I used the NATO mobile defense plan as the basis for my structure for the negotiation I was about to go into. So I actually had that written down, 4 lines of defense and what I was going to do at each of the 4 lines of defense. And the guy came at me, just a second or two of cordiality, and then he was screaming at me. He's like, Steve, we're not going to pay your silly Silicon Valley prices. I was a little taken aback, but I was prepared because I knew he was going to squeeze that rag and see if he could get something to drip out. So I said, I understand your concern there, but if you're asking me for a discount, that's going to present a problem for both of us. He said, what's the problem? I said, well, you could find, I'm sure, a lot of folks who would give you that discount, but I'm the one who's not going to, in the moment, satisfy that demand and give you a discount. Good news would be, as I come in and train your sales folks, maybe you anticipate that I would pass that strength on to them. On the other hand, you could go with that other option. Somebody's going to give you a big discount and then come in and spread that disease amongst your sales force. Which would you prefer?
I love that.
Well, he did too. And that really is the point of the story. Here's this guy being mean and gruff. I wouldn't have thought of that on the fly. That was preparation.
Yeah.
It wasn't even something I thought of. My partner in the role play thought of that. So I just said what a prepared line I had ready because you knew what was going to happen. And he said, silence. And he said, that's pretty smooth, Rob. I said, well, why do you want to work with this guy? And all of a sudden, we go from a guy who's screaming at me to, I don't know if you're familiar with the American expression, game recognizes game. But now he's thinking, oh, this guy isn't like most salespeople. When I scream at him, they just give me discounts. This guy is a player. He knows how to play. But he wasn't done with me. He said, respect, but Rob, on his way to finding you, found somebody else right here in New York, says he's got the same material as you and he's willing to do it for a lot less. I said, now I've been ambushed and my plan that I have written down all of a sudden isn't surviving first contact with reality here because I hadn't expected this. I owned a franchise at the time. And of course, franchisees aren't supposed to be undercutting each other's prices like that. So I was taken aback and I just said, does he know you're talking to me? He said, oh yeah, he knows. So this guy's like very having fun with the idea that he's taking advantage of this weakness.
So this was one of your franchisees that was talking to them. Yeah.
Yes, who's undercutting my prices and saying he has the same materials. Exactly. So I said to him, my plan is out the window, but I know the essence of my second fallback position is to walk away. So I said, given what you just said, sounds like you need to work with that guy, and I respect that. So one thing I'd like to ask before we end the call here, do you mind if I give you a ring after the training? And I'll ask you, is that guy good? Because believe it or not, at my silly Silicon Valley prices, I can keep my calendar full. I'll help fill up his calendar too. And I just didn't say anything. And the deal closed at that point with no discount. And this part you'll think I'm making up. People listening to the podcast will say, Steve, that's just the story. It's not true. The CFO, when I was doing the training, come bursting through the back door, brought along his CEO, who was a fairly famous guy. And they presented me my check with no discount in front of the sales team. And the CFO told the story I just told you. Awesome. So what is the point of the story? Behind great performance, you don't have to be a great natural negotiator. What you need to have is a plan. Yeah. 2, no plan survives first contact with reality, but the plan will help you improvise even when you hit something you didn't expect. And 3, game recognizes game. The reason I remember that one is because up to that point, I didn't earn anybody's respect in a negotiation. And in that case, it became very clear this tough negotiator thought I was a tough negotiator too. He didn't know I had sweaty palms and was nervous the whole time. I just sounded like I knew what I was doing.
Yeah, I love it. And, from a negotiation perspective, I love it because that's a classic example of using alternatives in a negotiation. So what I've seen you do is you've actually reality tested how good the alternatives that he had to negotiating with you were. That story about, are they going to come in and spread the disease? I love that analogy that you use there. That's getting him to think about, these other people, they might be cheap, but how good are they? And then that idea of, being prepared to walk away and say, well, yeah, actually, the option that you've got sounds like it's better than me. I'm not going to force you to do something that doesn't meet your interests as well as what I can do. So some really interesting things in there. One of the things that I noticed that you were talking about, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about this if you're able to, is you talked about the NATO mobile defence plan. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like and how you implement that?
Yes. This is just me borrowing a concept that somebody else developed. I can't even give credit to who, but when you're an inferior force up against a vastly superior force, and I'm going to kind of make up numbers, but they're also kind of real. And I'm going to name adversaries because this is an international broadcast and I don't want anybody to be upset. One time I used the actual countries and people were a little upset at the story. But if you're up against an opponent who has, for every one tank you have, they have 50. For every one artillery tube you have, they have 105. You're standing there looking at that situation saying, how am I going to win this thing? Well, in all combat or sports or competitions, if you're the big guy, you have advantages and disadvantages. If you're the little guy, you have advantages and disadvantages. And you just really got to think about what your advantages are and maximize those. So what a mobile defense plan is, you're up against 50 to 1 odds, 100 to 1 odds in terms of artillery. And you're sitting there trying to protect, a territory, and all these tanks come at you. In that case, our advantage was our ability, because we're stationary, to hit them accurately before they can engage us, because they're mobile quite as accurately. They're moving and we're not. And we could also, with our sights, see through smoke, and they couldn't. So we would use our few artillery tubes just to put smoke out there to obscure things while they're using theirs to make our day really bad. And so we could see them and they couldn't see us. And of course, if you got one tank and they got 50, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, so we had 0 tanks. We had little shoulder-fired things. And what we would do is use those advantages to engage and take out as many tanks as we could before they got within effective range. And then we would move backwards, as opposed to a die-in-place strategy. We would move through a second line that was already set up behind us. They would begin engaging. And then when we go back to a third line. So it was meant to be a trading of space and time for disabling the enemy's fighting capabilities. And you can see why you would really need to practice something like that, because you could also see how something that could turn into
There's a lot could go wrong.
So much. Friendly fire problems. It could turn into a massive retreat very quickly. It really has to be disciplined, especially when you're talking about a NATO operation where you got French, English, Australians, Americans, Belgians all over. They don't train with each other all the time. So we really needed to practice.
Yeah. So you turned this defense plan into the strategy that you use when you're working with salespeople. And particularly, I think when we spoke earlier, you talked about often there's a big power imbalance in the sales negotiations. Tell us a little bit more about what that power imbalance looks like and how somebody, what are some of the key tips that somebody could use to manage that power imbalance?
Yes, there is so often what I hear as I listen to call recordings and you're hearing a negotiation, you'll hear the buyer do what my buyer did. They're trained to do that. It's called an emotional outburst. That's actually trained. They're trained to do that, to act upset, because that evokes kind of a childlike response. And what that sounds like on tape is a salesperson will say, "Oh, I've upset you. Where do we need to be to earn your business?" And they're on bended knee like a beggar with a bowl. Well, when they do that thing called a flinch or the emotional outburst, if your first thought is, "Oh my goodness, he's got a point," the first concession is a mental concession. You're toast. So yes, if you're going into it and you haven't done a good job of selling, they've got the money, they've got what you need, and it seems like there is a big power imbalance. I myself, though, realized that as a person who's from the middle of the United States and not comfortable with negotiating, I felt like I didn't have the power when buyers pressed me to discount. But also, if I walk up to a hotel counter or a counter in a retail store, I don't negotiate there either. And I'm the buyer in that case. My wife from New York, on the other hand, she'll walk up and say, look, we're buying a lot of stuff here. Can I talk to the store manager? When she says that while I'm carrying all the stuff, I am absolutely mortified that she's having this conversation, but she gets a deal. And she's having fun, the store manager's having fun, and they end up fine and she gets a deal. So if you don't, you have to look yourself in the mirror sometimes and say, if I don't have the power when I'm the buyer and I don't have the power when I'm the seller, exactly when do I have the power? And the answer is never. It's not the position I'm in. It's the person I am and how I view it. If you choose to approach it as a victim, I just haven't met any rich victims. Yeah. So the seller seems like they're always at a disadvantage, but if you did a good job of selling, several of the sources of leverage in a negotiation and the sales cycle are working for you. If you did a good job of understanding the buyer's need, what their need is. How that need impacts their business. You understand what their cost of doing nothing is because that's part of the sales process and the diagnostic process you went through. And by the time you're done with a good sales process, you should see there's a power imbalance, but the power imbalance favors you because they actually need what you have, or you should have disqualified them and not pursued that opportunity. So what's perceived to be a power imbalance frequently that works against the seller is, I'm going to say, a mirage. And it's not the position. It's weak salesmanship, and it's the person, not the position that you're in.
Yeah, I love that. And also, I think, as you mentioned earlier, the preparation, the planning that you've done beforehand to go in armed. I hesitate to use the word ready for battle because I don't like to see negotiation as a battle. But, the more that you've prepared and you've thought about these things, the more confident you can be. And I love that analogy you used too about talking about making mental concessions. We often talk about concessions in negotiations, but that idea of a mental concession where you're actually conceding in your own head is one that I think I may borrow, if that's okay.
Oh, please do. The inner game of negotiating.
Do you ever feel stuck in a negotiation or conflict? You're not quite sure what the next step should be? Friends and colleagues may give advice, but perhaps they're only seeing things from your side. My new negotiation GP service is for exactly that situation. You can book a short, standard or long consultation where we will explore your situation using a systematic approach. You will walk away with concrete steps to follow and an increased confidence to manage the situation. To learn more, head to my website at nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au where you can book a consultation online. Don't forget, I also offer one-on-one coaching, team training, and expert advice on specific negotiations. My tailored approach is designed to meet your specific needs, and my proven methodologies and strategies are grounded in the latest research and best practices. So whether you're a small business owner, a corporate executive, or anyone in between, let me help you achieve your negotiation goals and maximize your success.
And by the way, you made a point about alternatives. When I said, look, it sounds like you got to go with the other guy in my negotiating with the tough CFO, when somebody comes with you with that very standard flinch, which is the competitive threat, if your belief at that point is he's actually going to go with the competition, that belief is, I'm going to say, false on its face. Because if he was going to go with the competition, why isn't he already given them a purchase order? He doesn't want to go with the competition. Neither did the tough CFO in New York. He wanted to go with me at a price closer to what my competition was offering. That's the true belief.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I wanted to change pace a little bit because one of the things that when we did our interview call that you spoke about was that you've been through litigation and you described it as a business war. I'm interested to know, obviously, once again, without sharing all of the specifics of it, but what was your experience of having to go through litigation, and how has that changed the way you negotiate?
Yeah. So in the end, as you said, it's probably important not to talk about a specific litigation or any, when you do settlements in the end, part of the settlement is you don't talk about it. So I will speak in generalities, but rooted in actual experience. I've been involved directly and indirectly in several litigations. And the first thing I would say is even winning can be a Pyrrhic victory due to the time and the energy and cost. It's really nice to think in American courts, it says right up behind the judge, justice for all. And we would like to think that's what's going on in a courtroom and that's what the court is aiming for. But unfortunately, it isn't. What American, I was in federal court, what American federal judges are doing is just trying to get things off their docket. They will do all sorts of things to get things off their docket. You think they're there to represent the little guy against the big guy? Sometimes it's not uncommon to find them sleeping up there. Federal judges sleeping at the big podium they're behind. And I've seen several judges nodding off in the middle of proceedings. They want to get things off their docket, and they do that by just kicking the can down the road. And when they just kick the can down the road, that drags out litigations, and they're not trying to do something evil to you, but what that does is that if there is a big company with in-house lawyers, so that cost is a fixed cost to them and they're going to have those lawyers, and you're a little guy that's having to pay some law firm to represent you, as the can is being kicked down the road, your legal bills are mounting and mounting and mounting to the point where you're spending...
Yeah, when you talk about the can being kicked down the road, Steve, are you talking about they're sending you back to get more information, or they're making procedural decisions? What does that actually look like?
All of that. A continuous tendency to try to say, this is it's not a criminal matter. It's a business thing. It's a contract dispute. Why can't two parties work this out? Why don't you guys just go work this out? Every time a lawyer on one side or the other asks for some sort of delay or additional discovery, or, there's a million ways to delay. 7 years is not a common length of time for a litigation to play out because of the judge's willingness just to say, yeah, let's stop dealing with this today and put it off to a day down the road. And the lawyers are continuously on both sides asking for some delay for some reason. Big guy, maybe because they want to bankrupt the little guy, regardless of the right or wrong. And maybe the little guy's lawyer because they want to run up the bills. There's all sorts of reasons why those sorts of things happen.
Yeah. And through that litigation process, did you have exposure to mediation? You said the judge would say, sort of go and sort it out yourselves. Did you have the experience of being in a room with a mediator to try and work these things out?
I think if you are actually having a legitimate dispute between two parties of fairly good faith, that is an option. And maybe it's an option too, where there really is. I mean, in every case, I'm sure both sides think the other guy is just evil. But when you're dealing with somebody who's really not dealing in good faith, I don't know how that would work. Yeah. And maybe that's something that you have an experience with, because your experience is way beyond my own. But I don't know how that would work, where you're working with dealing with somebody who's just, falsifying the books and that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, and it can be a difficulty where there are people that are being genuinely deceptive. That really is coming to mediation without good faith. which happens from time to time, unfortunately. I think my thinking is that, as you've said, I mean, the legal system, as I described to many people, it's not a justice system, it is a legal system. And there are things that can be abused as part of that process. And somebody who's going to come in and abuse that process will do it regardless of whether it's litigation, mediation. Now, unfortunately, the nature of the legal system is that it gives opportunity to those, shall we say, less honest or less trustworthy people to make things difficult for smaller players who might not have the resources to actually proceed with things in court. And it's unfortunately something I've had to explain to many a party in the litigation process through mediation, to actually explain why, although they might have a good case, accepting an offer that's far less than what they believe they're entitled to would make sense given who they're in the dispute with. So it can be a bit of a challenge.
I like the way you said that. It's a legal system, not a justice system. You definitely will walk out not feeling like it's a justice system. I think I haven't been involved in criminal cases, only in like contract.
And my discussion is solely about commercial as well. So, ultimately, I actually believe that the system that we've got, although it's not perfect for criminal, is probably okay. But I have a strong belief that for commercial matters or civil matters generally, we really need a very different system that's not so adversarial. One of the problems is that the legal system itself is something that makes the lawyers work against each other rather than with each other to problem solve. So you've got these games that lawyers play. Sometimes they get so excited about the game that they may forget that there's a client sitting in the background. I think there's some lawyers who do that. And, I think the Australian system is similar but quite different to the American system. There's probably more of that goes on in America even than here, I suspect, but I don't have evidence to support that statement.
Yeah, I know nothing about Australian courts. I've not experienced that.
It's probably a very good thing, Steve.
That's right.
Let's hope it stays that way.
By the way, another thing, and this is more on the positive side, but first of all, I came out of everything I've ever been involved in, even though it was expensive, time-consuming, nerve-wracking for me and my wife and everybody. I came out fine. So what I'm saying isn't sour grapes. It's just a look at the way things are in the system. And boy, you really got to think about it twice before you jump into it. The other thing about the U.S. system is to be willing to pay for legal advice right when you set up your company and right when you're creating intellectual property, prophylactically in advance. And he's no longer with us, but my little town country lawyer who set up everything for me as we got into this big drawn out, federal situation. So many times my lawyers would look at the work he had done and say, boy, we're so glad Ray set this up right. And he did. He did a good job of setting things up because you can't fix that once you're in litigation. You got to do it well up front.
And that is an amazing piece of advice for smaller businesses that might be listening into the podcast, because we never like having to give money to lawyers, but giving them that little bit up front to get the right systems to make sure that everything's being done correctly up front can save you a lot of heartache down the road. So an awesome piece of advice. Is there anything, just before we wrap up the interview, Steve, have you got what is the one piece of advice that you think everyone should have before they go into a negotiation?
Well, we'll go back to where we started with my ballerina back there. Edgar Degas said it takes great effort to make it look effortless. So just like anything, if you're throwing a dinner party and you put a great deal of effort into every little detail of it, when people come in, they're going to notice it, they're going to respect it, and they're going to appreciate it. That's all I did in that negotiation, where clearly the tough New York CFO said, hey, this guy knows what he's doing. A little preparation and effort, a process can take anybody and make them better than they were. And like you said, everybody needs to recognize they have a level of conscious competence in negotiating and everything. They have a system that they're using today, and it's perfectly designed to get the exact results they're getting today. So take pains to take it up a notch through preparation, process, consulting with people like you and I who do training in this space so that you're not reinventing the wheel. And like anything, you'll get better at it. And it is one of those things that is a tremendous profit center. In my training with a very large American global computer company, I won't say their name, when I asked them if we moved the needle on the level of discounting that their salespeople were doing as a result of the training, they said, yes, but we're not going to give you the numbers. And I said, why not? And they said, because the numbers are so good, you're just going to raise your prices, Steve. We don't want you to know what they actually are. Salespeople will spend a whole sales cycle, months working hard to build value, and then give it all up in an instant at the end of a negotiation when they're up against a savvy buyer who just uses a few negotiating gambits and takes advantage of them.
Yeah. Love that. So really interesting. I have enjoyed having our conversation today, Steve. If listeners have enjoyed listening and want to reach out and get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just Google my name, Steve Kraner, Kraner, or go to my website, www.softwaresalesgurus.com. And it's been a pleasure working with you too, Nicole.
Thanks very much, Steve.
That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.